The most expensive mistakes are usually the ones nobody can see yet. Ethan Walker stood alone near the observation deck of a 72-story tower that dominated the downtown skyline. Morning sunlight reflected from unfinished glass panels hundreds of feet above the city streets. Below him, crews moved through the construction site while trucks delivered materials according to a schedule worth millions of dollars each day. To everyone else, the project looked like a success. To Ethan, something felt wrong. He studied a large structural drawing spread across a temporary table. Lines, measurements, load paths, and connection details covered the page. Near the center of the drawing, one area had been circled with a red marker. The circle was not large. It covered only a single structural transition zone where several critical systems transferred load through the tower's core. Most people would never have noticed it. Ethan could not stop thinking about it. He checked the calculations again. Then again. The numbers themselves were not alarming. That was the problem. The danger was hidden inside assumptions built into the design revisions approved months earlier. Assumptions that looked efficient on paper. Assumptions that saved money. Assumptions that ignored conditions developing in the real structure. Ethan picked up the red marker and darkened the circle once more. A young site engineer approached him. "You are looking at that area again?" Ethan nodded. "I am." The engineer glanced at the drawing. The consultants reviewed it already. Ethan looked toward the tower. Wind moved across the upper floors. Steel supports disappeared behind concrete walls. "I know." The engineer waited. "Do you think something is wrong?" Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. "I think if that area fails, everything changes." The answer left the engineer uneasy. Later that afternoon, executives, consultants, and project leaders gathered inside a conference room overlooking the construction site. Rebecca Sterling stood at the front beside a digital presentation showing updated project forecasts. Progress remained ahead of schedule. Investors were pleased. Costs remained controlled. The atmosphere carried the confidence that often follows success. Ethan sat near the end of the table with the drawing rolled beneath his arm. When discussion turned toward structural milestones, he finally spoke. "I believe we need to review one section before we move forward." Several heads turned. Rebecca looked toward him. "Which section?" Ethan unrolled the drawing and placed it across the table. The red circle immediately drew attention. "This transfer zone." A consultant leaned forward. "We already reviewed that area." Ethan nodded. "I know." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Then why are we discussing it again?" Ethan looked directly at the drawing. "Because every time I check it, I see the same thing." The room grew quiet. Outside the windows, the tower stood against the skyline. Inside the room, nobody yet realized that a simple red circle was about to become the most important warning on the entire project. The conference room remained quiet for several seconds after Ethan's warning. Rebecca Sterling looked down at the drawing and then back toward the large digital display showing project schedules, budget projections, and consultant approvals. Everything on the screen suggested success. Everything on the paper in front of her suggested uncertainty. "Explain it," she said. Ethan placed one finger inside the red circle. "The revised load transfer design assumes uniform settlement through this section." A consultant immediately responded. "Because the modeling confirms it." Ethan nodded. "The modeling assumes conditions that no longer exist." Daniel Brooks leaned forward. "What conditions?" Ethan turned the drawing slightly. "The material behavior we measured 3 months ago is different from what the model is using today." Several executives exchanged confused looks. Rebecca folded her arms. "You are saying the consultants missed something?" Ethan remained calm. "I am saying reality changed." The room grew tense. Nobody liked hearing that on a project of this size. Daniel tapped the table. Our analysis has been reviewed multiple times. Ethan nodded again. I know. Then why are we still discussing this? Daniel asked. Ethan looked toward the tower visible through the conference room windows. The upper floors reflected the afternoon sunlight while crews continued working hundreds of feet above the ground. Because the structure does not care how many meetings approved the design. The statement landed heavily across the room. Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. What exactly are you recommending? Ethan slid a second sheet across the table. Pause progression through this section. Run a deeper field evaluation. Verify actual conditions before we continue. One executive immediately shook his head. That could delay the schedule. Another added, investors are expecting milestone completion next month. Daniel pointed toward the digital forecast. The data does not justify that level of disruption. Ethan listened without interruption. Then he opened a folder and removed several photographs taken during recent inspections. Small details appeared in the images. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Yet every photograph showed subtle changes occurring near the same structural zone marked by the red circle. Rebecca studied them carefully. These could mean many things. They could, Ethan replied. Or they could mean exactly what I think they mean. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Consultants defended the approved plan. Executives defended the schedule. Ethan defended only the structure itself. By the end of the meeting, no decision had changed. The project would continue exactly as planned. As people gathered their documents and prepared to leave, Ethan slowly rolled up the drawing. The red circle disappeared as the paper tightened. Rebecca stopped him before he reached the door. You really believe you are right about this? Ethan looked back toward the tower one last time. I hope I am wrong. Then he walked out of the room. Behind him, the meeting moved on. The schedules remained unchanged. The forecasts remained positive. And on a drawing tucked beneath Ethan's arm, the red circle waited quietly for the day everyone else would finally understand why it was there. The termination meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Ethan Walker knew what was coming the moment he received the calendar invitation. The conference room felt smaller than usual. Rebecca Sterling sat at one end of the table. Daniel Brooks sat beside her reviewing documents on a tablet. Through the glass walls, employees moved through the headquarters carrying reports, schedules, and project updates. Business continued as normal. Ethan took a seat without speaking. Rebecca folded her hands on the table. We need alignment on this project. Ethan nodded. I agree. She looked directly at him. Your continued objections are creating uncertainty throughout the organization. Ethan remained calm. My concern is the structure. Daniel leaned forward. The structure has been reviewed repeatedly. Ethan looked at him. The paperwork has. Silence followed. Rebecca opened a folder. The board expects progress. Investors expect progress. The consulting team has validated the current direction. Ethan glanced toward the tower visible through the distant windows. Sunlight reflected from the upper floors. Workers continued installing materials hundreds of feet above the city. Everything appeared strong. Stable. Successful. That was what worried him. Rebecca slid a document across the table. We have decided to move forward without your involvement. Ethan looked down at the paper. Then back at Rebecca. His expression never changed. Daniel seemed almost surprised by the lack of reaction. Rebecca continued. Today will be your final day on the project. Ethan sat quietly for several seconds. Then he nodded once. No argument. No anger. No attempt to change anyone's mind. Rebecca appeared slightly unsettled by the response. You have nothing to say? Ethan looked toward the tower again. I already said it. The room became quiet. A few minutes later, Ethan returned to his office. He packed slowly. A framed photograph of Lily. Several engineering books. Inspection notes. A coffee mug worn from years of use. Finally, he reached for the large drawing tube resting beside his desk. Inside was the structural drawing marked with the red circle. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he left it behind. Before walking out, he wrote a short note and attached it to the drawing. If conditions change, start here. That was all. Outside, the afternoon air felt unusually warm. Ethan drove home earlier than usual. Lily noticed immediately when he walked through the front door. You are home early. Ethan smiled. Looks like I get dinner with my favorite person tonight. Lily studied his face. Something happened. Ethan nodded. A little. She looked concerned. Are you okay? Ethan sat beside her at the kitchen table. I will be. Later that evening, after Lily went to bed, Ethan stood on the porch watching distant lights across the city. Somewhere beyond the skyline stood the tower. Somewhere inside that tower was a red circle nobody wanted to discuss anymore. And somewhere deep inside the structure, a problem continued growing quietly while the one person who recognized it was no longer allowed through the front gate. 3 days after Ethan Walker left the project, the first crack appeared. It was so small that most people never noticed it. A field inspector documented it during a routine review near the same structural transition zone Ethan had marked with the red circle. The crack measured only a fraction of an inch. It did not trigger alarms. It did not stop construction. It barely earned a mention in the daily report. Yet the inspector photographed it anyway. By afternoon, the image had reached several engineers. Most dismissed it immediately. Concrete developed minor imperfections all the time. The tower remained structurally sound. The schedules remained on track. The investors remained happy. There was no reason for concern. At least that was the official conclusion. The following morning, another inspection revealed a second crack. It appeared several feet away from the first one. Again, the dimensions were small. Again, consultants reviewed the findings and classified them as normal. Daniel Brooks stood before a technical review meeting explaining why the observations fell within acceptable tolerances. Charts appeared on large screens. Calculations supported the conclusion. The room relaxed. The discussion moved on. Yet one young engineer remained uneasy. He remembered Ethan's warning. He remembered the red circle. Most of all, he remembered Ethan saying, if that area fails, everything changes. Later that day, the engineer visited the transition zone personally. Workers continued their tasks around him. Equipment moved through the structure. Everything looked normal. Yet when he examined the area closely, he noticed something unusual. The cracks followed a pattern. Not random. Not isolated. Connected. The realization stayed with him throughout the afternoon. Meanwhile, Rebecca Sterling attended investor meetings celebrating construction milestones. Progress reports remained strong. Financial projections looked excellent. The tower continued rising above the city. Success seemed inevitable. Yet that evening, a brief technical summary landed in her inbox. 2 words immediately caught her attention. Progressive cracking. Rebecca stared at the phrase for several seconds before opening the report. The details remained inconclusive. Nothing suggested immediate danger. Still, she found herself remembering Ethan's expression during their final conversation. Not angry. Not defensive. Certain. Across town, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Lily with a school science assignment. For the first time in years, his evenings felt quiet. Lily smiled as she explained her project. Ethan listened carefully. Then his phone vibrated. A former colleague had sent a single photograph. No explanation. No message. Just an image. Ethan opened it and immediately recognized the location. The transition zone. The crack. He stared at the screen without speaking. Lily noticed the change in his expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. Ethan slowly set the phone down. Through the kitchen window, the city skyline glowed against the night sky. Somewhere among those lights stood the tower. And for the first time since he had been fired, the problem hidden inside the red circle had begun revealing itself to everyone else. The cracks kept growing. Not dramatically. Not fast enough to make headlines. But fast enough to create a problem no consultant could comfortably explain. By the end of the week, additional inspections identified several new locations showing the same pattern. Each crack remained relatively small. Yet together they formed a picture nobody wanted to see. The structural transition zone was behaving differently than projected. Inside project headquarters, emergency meetings began replacing celebration meetings. Large screens filled conference rooms with diagrams, stress models, and inspection reports. Daniel Brooks stood before a panel of engineers reviewing updated analysis. "The structure remains stable," he repeated. The statement was technically true. Yet nobody sounded reassured anymore. One engineer pointed toward the latest monitoring results. "Then why are the indicators continuing to shift?" Daniel adjusted another model on the screen. "We are still evaluating possible causes." Another engineer frowned. "We have been evaluating for days." The room fell silent. No one had a better answer. Meanwhile, the young engineer who had once spoken with Ethan found himself returning to the inspection reports repeatedly. Every new document seemed to point toward the same area. The same pattern. The same red circle. One afternoon he visited the affected section again. Workers moved through the tower as usual. Equipment operated normally. Yet the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Small measurements continued changing. Load responses varied slightly from expectations. Nothing looked catastrophic. That was what made the situation so frustrating. The problem existed in a space between obvious and invisible. Back in the executive offices, Rebecca Sterling reviewed the latest reports long after most employees had gone home. Her desk was covered with technical summaries. Every consultant had a theory. Every engineer had a recommendation. None of them matched. None of them explained why the issue continued progressing despite multiple corrective adjustments. She leaned back and stared through the office window toward the tower illuminated against the evening sky. For the first time, uncertainty had replaced confidence. Across town, Ethan Walker sat in the bleachers of Lily's school gymnasium watching her participate in a science competition. Parents applauded. Students presented projects. For a few hours, the tower disappeared from his thoughts. Then his phone vibrated again. Another photograph. Another inspection image. Another crack. Ethan studied the picture quietly before locking the screen. Lily noticed. "Work again?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Something like that." She looked thoughtful. "The thing you warned them about?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. Lily sat quietly beside him. "Do they know you were right yet?" Ethan looked toward the students gathered across the gym. "Not yet." The following morning, consultants delivered another round of recommendations. Additional modeling. Additional monitoring. Additional analysis. More meetings. More reports. More theories. Yet the cracks continued appearing exactly where Ethan predicted they would. Deep inside the tower, reality kept moving faster than the experts trying to explain it. And somewhere inside a forgotten drawing tube left behind after a termination meeting, a red circle continued waiting for someone important to finally look at it again. The drawing tube sat untouched in a storage cabinet near the engineering department. Weeks had passed since Ethan Walker carried it into the conference room. Weeks since he rolled the drawing across the table and pointed at the red circle. Most people had forgotten it existed. The tower, however, had not forgotten. On Monday morning, another inspection report arrived. Then another. Then 3 more before lunch. The cracks continued following the same progression. Not random. Not isolated. Predictable. The growing pattern finally forced project leadership to authorize a deeper review. Engineers gathered inside a temporary analysis room filled with drawings, reports, and structural data. The atmosphere felt very different now. Nobody talked about schedules. Nobody talked about investors. They talked only about finding answers. The young engineer sat quietly reviewing photographs when he noticed a reference buried inside an old meeting record. Ethan Walker. Structural concern. Transfer zone. Red marked area. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he stood up and walked directly to the storage area. 20 minutes later, the drawing tube rested on the conference table. Several engineers watched as he carefully opened it. The large structural drawing rolled across the surface. Silence immediately filled the room. There it was. The red circle. Every crack discovered so far existed either inside it or directly adjacent to it. One engineer leaned closer. That cannot be a coincidence. Another began comparing inspection photographs against the drawing. The matches appeared one after another. Nobody spoke for several moments. Then someone noticed the note attached to the corner of the drawing. If conditions change, start here. The room became even quieter. Meanwhile, Rebecca Sterling entered carrying the latest executive summary. She stopped when she saw the drawing. Recognition flashed across her face immediately. Where did you find that? The young engineer pointed toward the storage cabinet. Rebecca walked closer. Her eyes moved from the red circle to the crack locations highlighted on nearby reports. The alignment was impossible to ignore. Daniel Brooks arrived moments later. He studied the documents and frowned. We already reviewed this. The young engineer shook his head. No. We reviewed the calculations. We never reviewed why he kept coming back to this area. That distinction changed everything. For the next several hours, engineers examined every note Ethan had left behind. Handwritten observations filled the margins. Small comments. Tiny field measurements. Weather conditions. Material responses. None of it looked dramatic by itself. Together, however, the notes formed a roadmap leading directly toward the problem now threatening the project. Late that evening, Rebecca sat alone staring at the red circle. Outside her office window, the tower stood against the dark skyline. For the first time, she was not looking at a structure. She was looking at a warning she had chosen not to hear. And somewhere across the city, the engineer she had fired remained the only person who fully understood what would happen next. The call happened on a Thursday morning. Rebecca Sterling stared at Ethan Walker's number for nearly a minute before pressing it. Around her, the executive conference room remained silent. Engineers waited. Consultants waited. Nobody offered another solution because nobody had one left to offer. The cracks continued progressing exactly as Ethan's notes predicted. Every new report confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. The man they had removed understood the problem better than anyone still employed on the project. Across town, Ethan was helping Lily load supplies into her school project display when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the number. Lily noticed his expression. "Work?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Something like that." He answered the call. Rebecca spoke first. "We need to talk." Ethan looked toward the city skyline in the distance. "About the tower?" Several seconds passed before she answered. "Yes." Ethan remained calm. "I figured." Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the project headquarters for the first time since his termination. The building looked exactly the same. The parking lot was full. Employees moved through the lobby carrying reports and schedules. Yet the atmosphere felt different. People who once walked past him now stopped to greet him. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply stepped aside. News had spread. By the time Ethan entered the conference room, every seat was occupied. The large drawing with the red circle rested at the center of the table. Rebecca stood as he entered. No one missed the significance of that gesture. Months earlier she had led every discussion. Today she waited for Ethan to speak first. He studied the reports arranged across the table. Inspection photographs. Monitoring data. Structural measurements. Then he opened the drawing and looked at the red circle. It started exactly where I expected. Nobody disagreed. Daniel Brooks leaned forward. "Can it be corrected?" Ethan examined several pages before answering. "Yes." The room released a collective breath. "How?" Daniel asked. Ethan pointed toward several locations surrounding the transition zone. "You are treating the symptoms." He traced a line through the structural system. "The source is here." Engineers immediately began reviewing the area. Within minutes they discovered the connection Ethan had recognized weeks earlier. The room grew increasingly quiet as the implications became clear. Rebecca watched the discussion unfold. For the first time since the crisis began, the conversation sounded focused instead of desperate. Ethan was not guessing. He was explaining. He was showing them exactly what to look for and why. When the meeting finally ended, Rebecca remained behind. The conference room emptied slowly until only the two of them remained. She looked at the red circle one more time. "You knew this would happen." Ethan rolled up the drawing carefully. "I hoped it would not." Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. For the first time since the project began, she understood the difference between dismissing a warning and disproving it. And standing in front of her was the man who had seen the truth long before anyone else was willing to look. The solution began with a walk through the tower. Not a meeting. Not a presentation. Ethan Walker wanted to see the structure with his own eyes before anyone touched a single component. Early the next morning, he moved through unfinished corridors accompanied by engineers, inspectors, and project leaders. Rebecca Sterling walked several steps behind him. Nobody rushed him. Nobody interrupted him. The confidence that once filled the project had been replaced by something else. Attention. Ethan stopped repeatedly at locations connected to the transition zone. He studied support systems. He examined monitoring points. He reviewed recent measurements. Occasionally he wrote brief notes on a pad. Most of the time he simply observed. After nearly 3 hours, he finally gathered the engineering team inside a temporary field office. A large drawing covered the wall. The familiar red circle remained visible near the center. Ethan pointed toward several connected structural elements surrounding the affected area. "The cracks are not the problem." Several engineers exchanged confused looks. Ethan continued. "They are evidence of the problem." He traced a path through the structural system. "This section is transferring forces differently than the design assumes." The room grew quiet. Engineers began comparing his explanation against current field data. One by one, the pieces started fitting together. For weeks everyone had focused on visible symptoms. Ethan focused on the source. By midday, a corrective plan had been approved. Crews immediately began implementing the adjustments. Monitoring systems were recalibrated. Several construction activities were temporarily redirected. Additional reinforcement measures were installed in carefully selected locations. Nothing about the process looked dramatic. The solution relied on precision rather than urgency. Experience rather than panic. Over the next several days, engineers watched the data continuously. Every new report mattered. Every measurement received attention. Slowly, the numbers began changing. Then they changed again. The progression that had worried everyone for weeks started slowing. The cracks stopped expanding. Load responses stabilized. Monitoring trends began moving toward expected ranges. The first positive report arrived late Friday afternoon. Nobody celebrated. They simply waited for confirmation. Additional reports followed during the weekend. Then more arrived on Monday. Every update told the same story. The corrective measures were working. Inside project headquarters, relief spread quietly through every department. Engineers smiled for the first time in weeks. Executives stopped preparing contingency plans. Even Daniel Brooks seemed unable to hide his admiration. During a technical review, he looked across the table at Ethan. "You saw all of this before anyone else." Ethan glanced toward the reports. "The structure was trying to tell us." Daniel laughed softly. "I wish I knew how to hear it." That evening, Ethan arrived home carrying a folder filled with updated project reports. Lily sat waiting at the kitchen table. "Did they fix it?" she asked immediately. Ethan smiled. "Looks like it." Lily grinned. "I knew you would." Ethan laughed quietly. Across the city, the tower stood beneath the evening sky. The cracks that once threatened the project had stopped growing. The solution everyone ignored had worked exactly as Ethan predicted. And for the first time since the red circle appeared on that drawing, the future of the tower no longer depended on finding answers. It depended on remembering who found them first. 6 months later, the tower stood complete against the skyline. Glass reflected the morning sun across dozens of city blocks. What had once been a project surrounded by uncertainty had become one of the most admired developments in the state. Investors praised the outcome. Industry publications highlighted the achievement. Engineering organizations requested presentations explaining how the project overcame its structural challenges. Yet among the people who had lived through the crisis, one detail mattered more than all the awards and headlines combined. They remembered who saw the problem first. A ceremony was held on the observation level near the top of the completed structure. Executives, engineers, city officials, and project partners gathered to celebrate the milestone. Rebecca Sterling stood before the audience delivering remarks about perseverance, teamwork, and responsibility. Behind her, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the skyline stretching for miles in every direction. The tower looked flawless. Stable. Strong. Finished. Yet Rebecca knew the story could have ended very differently. As she spoke, her attention briefly shifted toward a familiar figure standing near the back of the gathering. Ethan Walker had arrived quietly, just as he always did. No special entrance. No attention-seeking. He stood beside Lily, who looked out across the city with wide eyes. Rebecca paused for a moment before continuing. Then she said something nobody expected. "There is one person this project owes more than anyone else." The room became silent. Engineers exchanged curious looks. Rebecca stepped away from the podium and looked directly toward Ethan. "Months ago, when success seemed guaranteed, one engineer warned us about a problem we did not want to see. The room remained completely still. He challenged assumptions. He challenged consultants. He challenged me. Several people smiled knowingly. Rebecca nodded toward Ethan. And he was right. No applause came immediately. The audience simply absorbed the moment. Then the recognition began. Engineers stood first. Project managers followed. Soon the entire room was applauding. Ethan looked uncomfortable with the attention. Lily looked proud. Very proud. Rebecca walked across the room and handed Ethan a framed copy of the original drawing. The red circle remained visible at the center. Beneath it was a simple inscription. The warning that saved the tower. Ethan studied it for a moment before quietly thanking her. Nothing more. No speech. No celebration. No attempt to remind anyone what had happened. That was never who he was. Later that afternoon, after the ceremony ended, Ethan and Lily stood near the observation windows looking across the city. The crowd had mostly disappeared. The tower felt peaceful now. Finished. Complete. Lily pointed toward the framed drawing under his arm. Are you going to hang it up? Ethan smiled. Maybe. She looked out at the skyline again. I still think the red circle was the coolest part. Ethan laughed softly. It was never about the circle. Lily tilted her head. Then what was it about? Ethan looked across the completed tower one final time. Paying attention. And as sunlight reflected across steel, glass, and concrete, the lesson remained visible to everyone who understood the story. The structure had been saved by calculations, engineering, and experience. But most of all, it had been saved because one quiet man refused to ignore what everyone else chose not to see.